I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Politics of Outsourcing Roundtable Webinar. My name is Arlene Itori, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. We encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the Submit button. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Frank Casal, founder and CEO of the Outsourcing Institute, for the formal introduction of today's speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene, and thank you for putting today's discussion together and producing another great webinar for us. Welcome all, welcome members and guests. We have an interesting topic here to address. As many of you know, Obama's State of the Union address was less than friendly to outsourcing. Some of you have said to me that you thought it was outright hostile to those in the outsourcing space and to potentially the future of outsourcing, if you will. And on one hand, my feeling is this is just a typical election cycle, and my initial response was that not to pay too much attention to the rhetoric. However, we received an inordinate amount of phone calls and emails from our members asking our opinion, asking if we could respond to this, asking if we could do something in response to what seemed to have a little more teeth, if you will, in it than previous political commentary in previous election years. I guess the icing on the cake was when Vaughn Hovey, one of our panelists here today, picked up the phone and called me and really pushed for us to do something. And hence, that was the genesis of today's topic. So I don't believe we're here with all the answers. Our plan is to address the issues, address the questions, and then maybe collectively all of us, with you here in attendance, can attack some of these topics and get a sense of what does this all mean. Is this something we need to keep an eye on? Where is it going? What impact will it have for those of you who are existing and potential outsourcers on the buy side? What impact will this have on those of you who sell, who are providers and advisors in this space? Will it be business as usual, or will some business potentially be curtailed or reduced or delayed, which will not be good news for many of you who kind of in this space. I want to ask Arlene to switch us to the next slide, if you could, Arlene, just to make sure I walk through those panelists that are here today. We have pretty much a dream team here of panelists, and actually more than I normally would select. Normally we go with 2, maybe 3 panelists, but I wanted to really make sure we attack this from all ends, if you will. So just kind of following this clockwise, if you will, on this slide. Vaughn Hovey is a longtime friend, longtime member and supporter of the Outsourcing Institute, truly a thought leader, former practitioner, current academic, and really you're the instigator here, Vaughn. So depending on how this webinar plays out, I can either thank you or be mad at you, but I'm sure I'll be thanking you. And then also Monty Hamilton, who's the CEO of Rural Sourcing, joining us. And part of this discussion is differentiating offshoring from onshoring. And Monty is certainly in the onshoring, I'll say rural sourcing business. Again, following clockwise, David Kinnear, again, longtime friend, member. David's chair of the Global Sourcing Council, knows the outsourcing space, true thought leader, loves to speak on the topic, and at some point today within the discussion, we will address social responsibility with regard to outsourcing, and who better to talk to than David with regard to that. We have our key practitioner on the line today, Vishal Ahluwalia. Vishal is one of the go-to tech sourcing guys. over at UBS. He's in the wealth management area. Very active speaker and community participant, and I thank him for participating and sharing his perspective. And last but certainly not least, Deepak Nambiar, certainly one of the go-to attorneys in the outsourcing space. Part of the buzz is on potential regulations and what does this look like from a legal perspective, and we'll be happy to address that or allow Deepak to help us get a sense of what's real and what is not. So that's it as far as our introductions. I think I have one quick kind of OI commercial slide for those of you who are not members, and I'll promise to make this quick. We have over 70,000 members here at Outsourcing.com. It's a global network. We're known as really a neutral go-to place, both from the buyer's perspective as well as the provider's perspective. People have referred to us as the really kind of the neutral go-to clearinghouse for information and advice on the topic. We've been referred to as the consumer reports of outsourcing, if you will. We provide services, everything ranging from training through our university. We have a really nifty outsourcing RFP builder tool that we're rolling out this year. We have a sister company in CMS if you're looking to hire an outsourcing person, or if you're looking for a job. CMS is basically a headhunter in the outsourcing space. We do local road shows. In fact, we have one coming up in the May-June time frame. We're finalizing dates and locale as we speak. But keep an eye out for our New York road show. And for those of you interested in marketing and sponsorship opportunities, we do some really interesting things there, and there's some contact information on the bottom. Thank you, Arlene. So, Vaughn, let's get right down to it. Let's talk about the State of the Union address. I'm going to pass the baton to you, buddy.
Yeah, thanks. While on our return from a vacation in Florida, we happened to be sitting in a hotel when January 24th, President Obama went through his State of the Union address. Clearly, his hour-long address hit a lot of topics, from the economy to the Iran to energy, of course. But what we want to share with you today is some key objectives that I heard dealing with the outsourcing side, and then through this conversation today, we'll talk about some of the potential implications. Flip to the next slide, Arlene. For some of you that may not have listened or read the follow-up on President Obama's State of the Union, here were some key things that made my ears go up, and I quote, "We will not go back to an economy weakened by outsourcing. If you're in a business that wants to outsource jobs, you shouldn't get a tax break for doing it." Now, clearly, we're not understanding at this point what industries or scope of outsourcing is being considered, but my ears went up, and let's go to the next slide. Now, we have a clue here when President Obama did give credit to MasterLock for insourcing approximately 100 jobs to Milwaukee from China. But once again, is this solely manufacturing jobs being the target or the opportunity? Look at the next slide. There were some potential implications as I listened to what he was trying to talk about. It's clear initially when he used the MasterLock that more need to be done in manufacturing focus, trying to bring jobs back from offshore to help our economy. But at the same time, we've seen in the industry that it's easy for people to misinterpret this message and raise concerns, or at times even become more reluctant regarding all outsourcing, including ITO and BPO initiatives, whether onshore or offshore. And of course, some might say, and I've had some friends of mine say, well, it's just semantics. Well, it may be, but we've seen at times where the media can pick up the word outsourcing and expand it to other things, and yet those of us that have been in the particular outsourcing market do know there are major distinctions between domestic, onshore, offshore, insourcing, and the like. Next slide. The other thing I found over the last really 8 weeks since the State of the Union, there's some other initiatives underway, and I want to share a couple of these just to give you an idea of maybe the dichotomy of what's going on. On the first one, there was an In-Source America Jobs Forum held in the White House with President Obama, 25 senior execs, and Harry Mosher, who's the founder of the Reshoring Initiative, to focus on the economics and the changes and specifically some TCO initiatives where out of that particular forum they felt that some of the U.S. costs now were 22% lower than China on TCO basis. Focus here was manufacturing. 2 days after the State of the Union, Vice President Joe Biden's out talking, and he's emphasizing the offshore call centers as not being good for our economy, making light of this, even using an Indian accent to try and get his point across. The third point, Representative Tim Bishop, a Democrat from New York, has put forth a federal bill, H.R. 3596, to make competitors with offshore call centers ineligible for federal grants and loans, called the U.S. Call Center and Consumer Protection Act. The key thing here is if you read the bill, it talks about civil penalties for those groups that don't follow it up to $10,000 a day. And the last item, President Obama was out in a speech in Iowa, again mentioned insourcing tax proposals being drafted, where the focus was on advanced manufacturing. But it does include eliminations of tax deductions related to movement of operations offshore, a minimum tax of foreign income coming from offshore. So just in these 4 points, you see 2 that are clearly manufacturing related, and 2, by the way, seem to be IT related. Slide 9. If you look at a brief history of outsourcing, many of us have been involved for many years, but of course, pre-1990s, facilities management was kind of the key thing in the private sector. The early 90s brought about ITO, beginning mostly with some data center activities, expanding into application development, call centers and the like from major suppliers in the marketplace at that time. There clearly was a key mark in the early 90s to emphasize the mega deals between Kodak, McDonnell Douglas, and others. Then the late 90s, early 2000s, BPOs started taking off where I felt the consultants and the service providers began to say, hey, we're doing some of that already. If it's not ITO, it's BPO. And so the market has expanded dramatically with not only backroom stuff and customer-focused functions across finance, HR, logistics, procurement, contact centers, and even legal at this point. Manufacturing outsourcing, when I was in manufacturing, tended to be the most strategic core function to which no one would ever outsource, even on the contract basis. Well, those of us know now that's changed too since the smaller in the 80s, now 90s, and more so, with major companies, Apple, Nike, HP doing it. And this is growing where companies are spending billions of dollars as well on contract manufacturing or outsourcing. So in the 20 years, if we look at 1990 or so, the development and growth of the outsourcing market with offshore capabilities coming along has included dramatically. Vishal, you have any other thoughts regarding this particular category?
Hi, Vishal. Are you still on the line?
Yeah, can you hear me, Frank?
Yes, much better now.
Just wonder if you have any other thoughts around history of outsourcing / offshoring.
Yeah, so I was coming to that. So when you look at the whole 360 paradigm of offshoring, outsourcing, I think if you look way back, you know, when the evaluation started in the barter system, and then if you look at when you talk about offshoring, the first, your guns are rolled to India just because India has a maximum magnitude of support globally from an offshore perspective. But during the British rule, I think cotton was exported to Liverpool and then manufactured and then sold within the European and the U.S. markets. So again, offshoring has different context and meaning. And now where we have matured right from when we started the data center consolidation, from IT outsourcing to BPO and KPO, now I think the time has come where companies are looking more from a market penetration standpoint rather than, the cost has already been achieved. Yes, it's a cost play. We have looked at cost, is always there. We are looking for a global workforce which can meet the competitive demands of the market and be competitive in the market. So the skills which are available in India or in China or in Philippines or in Latin America, they are as good as or better as skills available here. So it's not about, when you talk about offshoring, it's about taking jobs or pushing jobs. It's more about creating a rotational workforce. And vice versa, if you look at the large, pure play Indian companies or Chinese companies or even companies from Mexico or Latin America, they have started establishing their base in the U.S. So in a way, they are also giving employment and work and creating revenue for the local market here. And you know, if we move away from the pure play IT, you know, if you look at the other industry segment, so if you do the, you know, the math, I think IT plays only a very small component of the whole you know, pie chart. But again, it is in everybody's radar and eyes because it dearly affects the human capital aspect. And as we progress, I think from a business standpoint, I was listening to a 60 minutes of you know, the news broadcast, and the GE CEO, who is the czar of Obama for outsourcing and offshoring, and somebody interviewed him and asked him, where do you get your manufacturing done? And he says 40% is Brazil, some percentage in China. And then, you know, the question was, then what is you are trying to control and create here? And for that, he has a very, you know, ambiguous kind of answer. So when we look at offshoring, outsourcing, and the whole, you know, picture, I think it is, other than other thing, and you know, I had the opportunity when I set stage moving into these kind of roles, it brings culture awareness, it brings harmony and peace, and you interact with different cultures. At the same time, you bring that awareness how work can be performed where you are not able to perform that kind of a work, and it can be done by somebody who is better than you and support you in what you do best. Frank, over to you.
No, thank you, Vishal. And David Kinnear, let me steer in your direction for a moment. You know, as I sit back and listen to Vaughn and Vishal kind of just kind of distill the history of outsourcing into a couple of minutes, it's hard for me to conceive, you know, kind of that making a U-turn, that trend making a U-turn and going in the opposite direction. Can you conceive of that at all? I mean, there's just so many companies that have done so much outsourcing, both onshore and offshore. You know, what do you think of the likelihood of that, or what do you think of the reality of that playing out?
Frank, well, first of all, thanks for having me join this call. I think the likelihood of a U-turn here is almost zero, no matter what the political rhetoric may be, for good or for bad reasons. And that's not to discredit or doubt the credentials of people, you know, offering these opinions, or the reasons why they maybe take a view for or against outsourcing, et cetera. It's just, from my perspective, from certainly what we see, the likelihood of a U-turn here is pretty much zero. Other than perhaps in individual cases. The Chinese have an expression, I'll share it here, it's an anonymous proverb, and it goes like this: change is a dragon. You can ignore it, which is futile. You can fight it, in which case you will lose, or you can ride it. Now, in this particular case, I actually think that outsourcing has, maybe somewhat deservedly, but maybe somewhat undeservedly, kind of carried the can for a lot of change and a lot of angst around change. But I think the real change, the real underlying issue that we're dealing with here is technology itself, and a transferal from a historic marketplace, a geographic marketplace, to a global marketplace. And the biggest issue here is going to be an acceptance, not a laying down of arms, so to speak, but an acceptance that we operate now in a global marketplace. And that has very, very significant consequences, both from a social perspective and also from an economic perspective. And just on your U-turn question, let me just throw this into the equation here. Often we talk about outsourcing, we talk about industries as sort of static points. So is outsourcing here to stay? Yes or no? My own view, we see this clearly looming in the legal and compliance outsourcing industry finally, is that cloud changes everything, so, and for everybody. So whatever we see right now in terms of outsourcing, and whatever the debate may be, when you apply cloud to everything that we're talking about and the agility that that creates on both the client and the provider side, it changes everything. And I think for the agile, for those that ride the dragon as opposed to fighting it, I personally think that it opens up enormous opportunity on both sides of that equation, whether you look at the economic side or the social side. I think there are huge, huge dividends. So I think no U-turns in the near future, in my view, even though I think there might be some political rhetoric down the line here. But I think if we seize the opportunity and run with it, there's far more upside here than there is downside. There you go.
So thank you, David. I have to, and this is Frank back here again, but I have to tell you, the realist in me, the pragmatist, agrees with you. However, when I look back at some of the earlier slides that Vaughn had shown with regard to some of the pending legislation, it does make me wonder. I mean, if you would have asked any one of us maybe 5 or 10 years ago, what are the odds of having a state-owned bank or automobile company here in the States, we all probably would have said 0 as well. So there's still that kind of, there's still a small percentage of my brain that feel that something could play out in an odd way here. But let's see. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why we're discussing.
Agreed, Frank. But there is that sort of certain magical moment when I recall for years learning to swim. And there's that magical moment of leaving the side rail and actually swimming. This is an environment in which we cannot afford to hold on to the side rail. We have to embrace technology and embrace what it means and embrace what a global marketplace means, because that's how we'll win in that kind of marketplace. And I think the legislation that takes us back to a very protective place, while it may be very tempting, I firmly believe that we will miss out on some of the opportunity ahead because of the very technology that could be adopted and utilized and leveraged. At the end of the day, you know, the global economy is kind of a conveyor belt, or more to the point, an escalator. And you have to keep making your mark on that global escalator. And it feels very comfortable to move down a peg or two, but in reality, you have to be constantly moving up the escalator. So I certainly hear what you say about the rhetoric and the legislation. I think that this year, more than perhaps in 1 or 2 prior election cycles, we will see and hear more about this, and I think that's a reflection of the fact that the U.S. economy has been in such a difficult shape, and there are very real economic implications of job loss. And anything that I may say is certainly not in any way to lessen the blow of job loss from individuals impacted by this. It's a very, very serious and personal situation. But I think the legislation, if we see ourselves go through this kind of phase, would be very short-term and would position us badly in terms of being able to operate in a global marketplace. And like we say about the dragon, like we say about change, whether we choose to accept it or not, it will happen. So we have to position ourselves for the economy that is clearly unfolding.
Great. Thank you, David. Let's switch over to, in the interest of time, there's a couple of slides I want to make sure we get to talk to here. Let's switch over to definitions. Many would argue part of the challenge in some of the political rhetoric is that it implies that all outsourcing is offshoring. And as those of us know in the business, that is clearly not the case. Before we dive a little bit deeper into this slide, I'm going to pass it to you in a moment, Monty. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. One that I wanted to mention on the front end, and one that is a modification. We were a couple minutes late to dialing into this call, so apologies for those of you who are waiting. We had voice / telecom issues on the line for those of us dialing in as panelists. We had trouble hearing each other, so we were concerned that you would not hear us. So we were working to rectify that. Seems to be working well, so whatever you did, Arlene, is helping. Just another modification is in my introduction of Vishal Ahluwalia. I may have referred to him as the ITO guy at UBS. His focus, although he does have a good amount of experience in the ITO space and BPO, Vishal's focus is within the BPO arena for wealth management and operations over at UBS. I just want to clarify that. Now, back to definitions. Monty, let me put you on the spot. This seems kind of remedial, but I felt that we should address this, right? So you want to take a shot at a couple of these terms?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think Michelle and I decided I would cover the bottom 3 and he the top 3. So, and part of the reason we put this in here is to give it some context, because unfortunately the term outsourcing gets used synonymously with offshoring. And for those practitioners, buyers, advisors, service providers in the business, obviously not one and the same. But near sourcing, and one of the things to add on to the points that were made earlier, I think we are clearly in a global environment from a workforce point of view. And what has gone on in the last few years is each of the regions across the globe has decided, how will I compete with India and China and other regions to employ my people? So if you think about that from a near sourcing point of view, Latin America, Mexico, even the Caribbean islands now, from a near sourcing point of view, collectively embraces that group of countries who are going after the outsourcing business, whether that be BPO, call center, or IT outsourcing. Similarly, something that we're trying to do within the rural sourcing America, and these are obviously U.S.-centric definitions, if you will. In terms of rural sourcing, it's really the practice of putting in development centers in Tier 2, Tier 3 locations here in the U.S. Again, to try to leverage the workforce and take advantage of some of the cost savings, the labor arbitrage that's available within the U.S. here. And then finally, insourcing is the term that Vaughn used at the beginning, which was the quote from the current administration, which there's an entire website dedicated to this now. Though there weren't enough sourcing terms out there, the administration had to come in and throw another one, which, as Vaughn alluded to, really just complicates the discussion a little bit more, when in reality businesses first ask themselves the question, what are our core competencies? What do I want to do in-house versus outside the building? And unfortunately, or right or wrong, today the administration is using insourcing as a term to talk about manufacturers who've decided to either place their own manufacturing locations here in the U.S. or in some cases to bring those manufacturing operations back to the U.S. So Michelle, I'll throw it over to you for any other enlightenment on the top three.
Yeah. So I think for me, global sourcing is, right location, right place at the right time, and people who can align and support the needs to meet the demands at the marketplace. If you look at the IT and the BPO, BPO is just like a theater where you have to do a ditto and a carbon image of the processes, what you do onshore, and you replicate, and you may give the name of outsourcing or offshoring. And if you look at IT, it's like a movie. It's a continuous development and improvement of the work, which you have to get it performed with changes and addition and alterations. So there can be some tweaks there. But I think outsourcing, offshoring, these are all based on the business needs. And then comes the rural sourcing and the nearshoring, follow the sun model. As in global companies, they have presence all across the globe, and both from a help desk standpoint, both to support their internal clients as well as external, companies are looking for avenues and opportunities and to penetrate different markets. They are looking for areas where they can grow their competencies, do a offshore and outsourcing from that country, like China, India, Brazil. Everybody knows these are big markets. How do you penetrate your product and services there? I think this is a caveat a lot of companies are using and taking this forward. Also, I think the outsourcing, offshoring, the words which has taken a connotation, and it's in everybody's eyes. How do you offshore? How do you outsource? And this has taken the new shape where all people like us who are in the call, when we attend these sessions and you participate in larger forums, we talk about innovations, and these innovations are leading to domain-based competencies. These innovations are leading to how do you improve on SLAs. These innovations are leading to how do you get more from the services you are getting from a different region, and they take shape of outsourcing and offshoring. And again, as Monty mentioned, rural sourcing, which has become a bigger aspect, of things which can be done out of North Dakota, Harrisburg, or other areas, which has taken greater precedence on the work which you cannot outsource. And then we look at Latin America and other countries which are growing and trying to have some niche skills which they can provide and meet the demands of any client. So Monty, anything else?
No, that's good, Frank.
No, thank you both. I mean, it's interesting looking at this slide that how many flavors of outsourcing there are, and I'm sure we left out one or two or three. You know, it would be wonderful if when the politicians refer to outsourcing, they specify. I mean, to this minute, I'm not sure if they're against offshoring or all outsourcing. Does anybody on this panel want to weigh in? If they do, they think that the problem that they have, you know, whether it's real or rhetoric, is it with offshoring or is it with outsourcing overall? Deepak, I'll put you on the spot with that one. How would you weigh in?
Frank, I believe it's more to do with the perception about offshoring, and not so much on-site, you know, or onshoring really. And I mean, everything ultimately boils down to perception, right? I mean, we are in a tough economy. The elections are right around the corner. You know, people are losing jobs, so there's a lot of you know pressure on all sides. You know, one thing I would say, you know, I kind of piggyback, trying to piggyback on some of my prior speakers are the following. That is, one is, you know, I think there is a lot of, even in this pressured economy, there is a lot of incentive or a lot of benefits both for service providers as well as for buyers of outsourcing services to kind of try to come up with a different model or kind of a middle ground, just to kind of maybe, for lack of a better term, appease some of the I guess people who are against outsourcing, especially offshore outsourcing. One is to increase, from a service provider point of view, one thing which I would say is maybe to try to increase local hiring and local presence. And then classic, case on point is in the UK, for instance, one of our clients, the Tata group of companies, they acquired Jaguar Land Rover, and this is more on the manufacturing side, but they added about 1,000 jobs. I know of other, Indian IT companies which are actively doing a lot of on-site, onshore, hiring. For instance, 3,000 member for a company, a unit being set up in Ohio by the Tata Consulting Services, and then several other companies like that. Second one is kind of need to strike a balance between the percentage of offshore versus the onshore outsourcing. Again, it's all about perception. So if service providers can actually bring forth the point that yes, there is some offshore outsourcing happening, but there is also a lot of jobs being added on site. That probably is probably going to help their public relations case. For buyers of outsourcing services, again, embrace rule sourcing, which is one of the points which have been kind of thrown out. Work with foreign service providers to bring some of the jobs onshore, and also work with several of the states and federal governments for better tax breaks and incentives. Kind of rewards for keeping the jobs onshore in the U.S. Several of the states which were mentioned today, like North Dakota, Ohio, Utah, I guess Florida, now offer amazingly attractive tax incentives and other incentives for local companies. I mean, new companies to come in and do business there. So I guess it's while there's a lot of taboo around the term offshoring, but I think it can be kind of we can work together, both service providers and the buyers of the services, to see if we can strike a middle ground and go forward, because this issue is not going to go away overnight.
Deepak, you have clients both on the buy side and the sell side, if I understand correctly, and my sense is, and you can correct me if I'm mistaken, my sense is you're not concerned yet, but at some point you may be, and you may want to begin to caution your clients. What would have to take place in coming months to start to get your attention, where you would begin to pick up the phone and start cautioning or counseling some of your clients, either on the buy side or the sell side?
Frank, I think it has already started happening, and I think this goes back to a question which we talked earlier about the likelihood of a U-turn. And I'll pick on that particular topic and then progress into what you just asked. I think the likelihood of U-turn will depend on a number of factors. One is how the market is going to play out. Are we going to go south, or is it going to be an improvement? Clearly, if there's an improvement, the argument against outsourcing is going to probably go away. On the other hand, if the market continues to deteriorate, then we have a larger issue to kind of discuss. The second one is increasing costs in popular outsourcing destinations like India and Philippines. Clearly, costs are going up, and a lot of our Indian service providers now see value in either going to other destinations outside of India, like for example Malaysia or Poland, or even actually bringing some of the jobs back to the U.S. A place like Ohio or North Dakota, where you get actually very good labor for pretty attractive costs. Third one is to do with whether there are going to be increasing number of tax breaks or other incentives which U.S. states or the federal government may actually provide to companies who are thinking about sourcing. If those tax breaks and other incentives increase, maybe then there is a better argument not to outsource or keep some of these jobs still back at home. And then the last one is this, which I think is kind of subsided by now, is the other ancillary considerations, which I would say, not ancillary only for today's discussion, but otherwise important, things like privacy considerations for banks. Some of the banks bringing back their outsourced jobs back to the U.S. because they have privacy concerns. The jobs being they're being handled in India or Pakistan or some other place in Asia. So I think there are a lot of factors which will kind of determine how this whole situation is going to play out. I do see though that there are in certain sectors that people have already started making a move, especially on the service provider side, to bring some, actually at least have some on-site presence. One is the healthcare with all the Obamacare. We see a lot more of these medical transcription companies, medical billing companies, either setting up captive units in the U.S. or acquiring companies. So there is definitely a move in that direction. How increase it's going to be over the next months or years to come, we will just have to see. But I think it's definitely going to increase, at least in the short term.
No, great. Thank you so much, Deepak. Before we dive into socially responsible outsourcing, which is an intriguing topic, I wanted to address some of the questions and comments from you here within the audience, just skimming through here. Interestingly enough, Arlene, one of the first comments is to say hello to you, so see how popular you continue to be. Another comment basically saying this is an important and timely topic. There's another comment here. The likelihood of a U-turn for outsourcing as a model is reliant on the cost-value relationship. It came into being because of cost arbitrage. If that advantage goes away, and it's beginning to, the trend will turn. So that's an interesting comment, basically saying, hey, it could be possible. Now, to contrast that with the following comment by another attendee who says here, unless Wall Street is okay with lower savings, outsourcing is here to stay. So that kind of nets it out. There's a question here with regard to reshoring. The question is, what is reshoring? Vishal, do you want to address that? That term came up briefly before. I'm not sure who mentioned it on this call.
Reshoring and insourcing are somehow interlinked. Reshoring is, if you have capabilities in a different location due to certain, parameters, you want to bring it back. It could be on the topic what we are discussing. It could be something which on the supply side which is happening, but also reshoring could be when companies work through service providers and have their own captives. During my Unisys days, we had captive as well as we worked with our vendor partners, and for economies of scale and to make sure the IP remains with us, we brought a lot of stuff from the vendor to your own captive so that we can scale it up. So reshoring does not exactly mean you pull back all the stuff you have in an offshore location and move it back. Yes, reshoring has a different meaning. When I was in Credit Suisse, it was probably the domain-based competencies we were trying to do and trying to create a scenario by which each domain could be supported out of one location which can support different functions from a technology standpoint. So that is the true definition of reshoring. But if you look at from a broader term, from a layman term, reshoring is, okay, GM has outsourced X number of jobs or Coke has outsourced X number of jobs. For certain reason, they want to pull it back because it's a tax rebate, or it is due to certain other reasons which is compelling the business to bring it back. But interesting enough, last week during the Global Sourcing Conference, there was a topic which was discussed about, the SEZs in India, which will, lose that tax bracket within the next 2 years, and how the buyers and the service providers are working together to make sure it continues, or to house in a place where the tax advantage still could be, obtained, and that could be again reshoring. So anybody else who want to, dig in, please do so.
Yeah, this is Vaughn Hovey again. I would hope that President Obama's administration would use the term reshoring as opposed to insourcing. I think that would help define the scope of, or at least what I see some of the legislation, keeping his use of the word insourcing, I think, because you can do that domestically, and it is being done domestically. But to be more specific on the reshoring would make more sense, I think, from their view.
Thanks, Vaughn. Thank you, Vishal. Another quick comment I see here. We'll dive right into socially responsible outsourcing. It goes as follows: Would Apple have $96 billion in cash if they kept manufacturing in the U.S. and not outsourced over 500,000 jobs? So just it's interesting. There are just as many comments as questions in this discussion from the audience. That's interesting. So let's switch over to socially responsible outsourcing. David, it's something that it's a topic that's been near and dear to your heart, kind of before it was cool, right? And now it's kind of in. So you want to talk to that a little bit, David?
Sure. My little plug, my one little plug for the Global Sourcing Council will simply address that, which is in 2000, actually late 2006, beginning of 2007. A few of us felt that there was an issue around sourcing, sustainability, and social responsibility, kind of a convergence of those issues because of these very issues, the outsourcing industry, the very large macro-level labor and socioeconomic issues that were sort of starting to come to the table, and now it's become very topical. So I encourage you to take a look at the organization. But I think, Frank, if you take Apple as the example, and somebody's comments on the line about Apple and that sort of thing, I don't know the U-turn question. Personally, I think the likelihood of Apple repatriating or basically bringing all of those jobs into the U.S. as opposed to manufacturing elsewhere is zero, and that's why I make my comment about the U-turn. Because even taking the point about labor arbitrage, I think in all practicality, I just don't see this as being something that investors are going to adopt. You have here a very, very difficult emerging issue. You have a historic and geographical view of the world competing with, in effect, a technology-driven view of the world. So if you're a service provider, if you're a business, increasingly your view is not national or domestic. It's not bound by a geography. It is bound by technology. Maybe one of the issues that we have here is that the taxation system, the financial systems, maybe some of the protective financial measures haven't actually caught up with how business now operates. It's been a view of mine for a while that the fiscal policy in the U.S. has not necessarily kept up to speed with how technology helps us to deliver services. But there are two implications here. I love the fact that somebody brought up balance, because I think balance is an absolute key word. It's at the heart of the 3S awards, the socially sustainable awards in May. You've got onshore implications. There is absolutely an implication. There are socioeconomic and taxation implications of losing jobs. So if jobs are lost, you have a net loss of income, and you have potentially a tax burden locally and nationally. On the other hand, you have an offshore issue. You have a question of standards, and it raises very, very interesting questions. So in the case of Apple and some of its recent press, you really do have a fiscal question at the heart of all of this, which is, on the one hand, do taxpayers want to support effectively an employee base, a national employee base that is not employed? If so, they have to start making value-based decisions about the manufacture of things like iPads in China. To date, and this is why I say the U-turn, I don't think it's coming, to date, it's very, very clear that people buy, and they will buy product, and they will put to one side the view of the marketplace, the sustaining the individual. The dollar drives the equation, and it has done for quite some time, and historically it always has. So here you have this emerging issue of a historic and geographical view of the marketplace, which I think is more institutional, versus what is in fact a financial and technology-driven marketplace. The one thing, though, the thing that I would like to leave behind for this call, though, is not to think of the bad side of outsourcing, so to speak, which I think there's been an awful lot of press about that. And this is why, having introduced the Chinese proverb, I want to leave you with a picture of Egypt. In Egypt, if you look around at all the various statues of the pharaohs and the warriors and everything else, you'll notice something very quickly. And every single one of them, and there's some huge statues, I mean, they're sort of several stories high, and they stand erect, and they're quite impressive feats of construction. Every single case, the left foot is outstretched, it's forward, and there's a supporting structure there. And you look at every single structure, and eventually you ask, why is that? And the answer is because, A, it's a more stable structure, and that's how people make those kinds of structures stand up. But the other thing is that it shows the push forward. In that period of history, it was very, very important to show, and always show, the confidence and the push forward. And I truly believe that the U.S. perhaps has its best years ahead, but we have to be confident, and we have to adapt to a global marketplace. That doesn't mean there aren't protectionisms that we can bring in, and those protectionisms may protect us both economically and from a socioeconomic perspective. We may have correct and appropriate standards around the workplace. But at the end of the day, and I think this is absolutely key, the U.S. has to be confident going forward, and we have to put confidence into what we're doing and step forward with that left foot in confidence. I personally feel that part of that is making the U.S. economically the absolute best place in the world to invest. And I think if you could absolutely focus on investor confidence in the U.S., frankly, you'd see some of this change anyway, but this issue might just become less of an issue as the overall economy picked up. But I think at the heart of this is a global economy and embracing what that means and embracing the technology that is making it happen. Change is hard. Loss is hard. Most times in life, we can't do anything about it. We actually only prolong the pain if we don't deal with it. And here, I think, as we go forward, we've got to do it with confidence, but address the fact that we now operate in a global marketplace, and technology is the genie, and it's out of the bottle. If we do that, I think we've got great years ahead. And I think you'll see plenty of jobs created in the U.S. that way as well. And it's not just a labor arbitrage. Even though a lot of outsourcing is done based on arbitrage, a lot of it's done on quality as well. And I think if you find that kind of work environment created, that kind of investment environment created, you'll also see plenty of opportunity created in the U.S. because people will want to be here.
Thank you, David. And in the interest of time, let's move to the next slide. Let's talk about the current political initiatives, and let's talk about some of these potential threats, real or imagined. Monty, what's your sense? You have a business that is dependent on this business. So are you feeling emboldened by this rhetoric, meaning it's good for your business as a rural sourcing kind of, U.S.-based operation, or are you a bit, anxious as well, meaning, the whole business could be slowed down a little bit? What's your sense?
Yeah, I would tend probably, Frank, to lean toward the latter. Listen, the reality is I'm not going to go build a business that's hopeful about our government supporting that business, right? Our business is based around being competitive with offshore or nearshore and providing a solution for our clients that weighs in from a cost, a quality of service, et cetera. And so while there's some of this that I think is bringing the discussion to the forefront, just as we're doing here, at the end of the day, I'd be hard-pressed to say that there's going to be a sea change coming out of the federal legislation about this stuff. Now, I do believe that there are some current, if you think about new legislation versus in August of this year, the Palmer versus Infosys trial will go to the Alabama Supreme Court to be heard, and that is over the abuse of B-1 visas primarily. And so some of the compliance issues, whether it be Visa or in the case of Apple, as we've seen with Foxconn, some of the other social issues out there, I do believe that those issues have some impact on our discussions and, frankly, on the buyers. I think the old school buyer world was talk to me about cost, quality, and service. All things being equal, I think there's a fourth dimension now that many buyers are looking at, which is what are the social impacts or implications of what I'm doing and where I'm getting either my product or my services from. And there are companies out there that are clearly embrace this and use it as a differentiator and competitive advantage. You don't need to think any further than Starbucks, Chipotle, or Burt's Bees, for example, to think of companies who have done well financially and they're doing good at the same time. And so some of those discussions are happening at the highest levels of the executive suite these days of where does this fit into how we get our product to market, not only how we sell it to our consumers, but then how do we engage them in the overall experience of what we offer as a company.
Great, thank you, Monty. Deepak, you touched on this earlier, but from your sense, from your radar as to pending legislation, any additional threats, any additional things you'd want to comment on as far as word to the wise?
Frank, I guess, if we look at the history of all the various legislations or bills that have been aimed at restricting outsourcing in the past, I mean, from the past several years, I'm not just talking about the recent move against the IT or BP outsourcing, but, right from, I think, 10, 20 years, years back in time when we saw the initial, I guess, some restrictions being tried to be placed on manufacturing, especially in the steel industry. There have been several legislations or bills rather that have been introduced at different points in time, depending upon who was in power, whether Republicans or the Democrats, to kind of curtail outsourcing, especially when it comes to offshore sourcing. Many have, most of the recent ones, at least in the last 4 or 5 years, what have we seen, have not really seen the light of the day. And especially so in the last year or so with the Republicans in majority of the Senate. There are 2 important legislations which are out there. I mean, at least the 2 significant ones which have got a lot of press. One is a bill which has been introduced by Tim Bishop, who's a Democrat from New York. It's called Communications Workers of America. I guess the bill itself is called. I forget what the bill is called, but essentially, it's essentially sponsored by Tim Bishop and the Communications Workers of America Union, and it essentially is aimed to, it would make companies that outsource their call center work ineligible for guaranteed federal loans and grants for a period of 5 years. And there is also a civil penalty of $10,000 for each day of violation. So that's one significant bill, and the bill is called the United States Call Center Worker and Consumer Protection Act. That's one. The second one is the significant one is Senator Chuck Schumer of New York have called for a taxation of foreign call centers, and that is essentially companies that transfer domestic calls to foreign countries would have to pay a per call excise tax, which again has created quite a lot of buzz. And the third significant one, which is actually, it's actually an executive order which has been passed, somewhere, I think sometime in 2010, is actually the state of Ohio governor, Ted Strickland, enacted an executive order of 2010 banning the expenditure of public funds for offshore services. So these are the 3 main, the first 2 are, of course, bills. The third one is actually an executive order, but, for the state of Ohio, which have got quite a bit of press in the recent past. As for our 2 bills pending, we just have to wait and see how the elections pan out, and who comes to power, and who gets the Senate majority and all that stuff. But as things stand now, there is obviously a lot more talk about trying to take away the tax incentives which are available for companies who are offshoring, especially on the BPO and the IT side of things. And also especially on, and our second one is where the federal grants are concerned. I see that the restrictions on federal grants are probably going to be much more successful than the former bunch of legislations, and also any kind of state legislations like the one which was passed by the governor, the executive order rather, which was passed by the governor of Ohio. I think that will have more of impact rather than some of these other legislation or bills which are pending right now. What does it mean going forward? I think we will continue to see more of these as we get closer to the elections. How it will pan out, only time can say.
Deepak, thank you very much. And I'm looking at the clock. We're a couple minutes over, and I'm sensing we're having some audio problems again, so apologize to those of you in attendance. This happens very rarely, but it does happen on occasion. So a couple of quick comments I just want to read from those of you who had typed them in. Let's see, one is here, two definitions that were not covered, homeshoring and onshoring. I guess we left those two out. Next comment to David is absolutely right. Countries will throw up protectionist legislation to their own detriment. Another question, is there a lobby force for outsourcing or offshoring? I don't believe there is, but maybe we'll have to all add that to the list. Think about that. Many thanks to Vaughn for instigating the forum. This was valuable. There you go, Vaughn.
Thank you.
Should Walmart be taxed for taking away garment industry jobs? For lowering wages and union jobs in the grocery store market. Using outsourcing is much like using any supplier, and much of that is already global. So yes, I agree. Interesting comment. And this was an amazing event. Thank you all. Thanks to all the panelists. And no, that wasn't from my mom. And there's a couple others here. And what I'll do is I'll see if we can cut and paste to maybe send these out. I want to thank you all for joining. I'm getting the hook here from Arlene. I think if she could play music now, she would play it. I want to thank our panelists who have day jobs. Thank you all for taking the time to address this issue. My advice to everyone in this industry, whether you're a buyer or a provider or somehow make a living in this marketplace as an advisor or what have you, keep an eye on this. Again, I'll say what I said at the outset. I mean, I don't believe this is going to go in a funky place, but it may. It just may. Stranger things have happened, and I think we'd all be remiss, and we would increase our risk of being blindsided if we didn't keep an eye on how this plays out before the election and after. I can personally assure you that we'll do our best to keep an eye on things and share with you in forums like this our perspective and those of others. So once again, thank you all. Thanks to our panelists, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks, Frank.